Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today we have Lyell Asher with us. He is a professor of English at Lewis and Clark University. And so we've got a lot of questions for you, Lyell, but before we get started, did you bring anything to the table? I know it's earlier for you than it is for us to drink for this conversation.
I'm just drinking water today. I'm sad to report.
It is Thursday and hitting on happy hour where we're at. David, what about you?
With a little scotch, not too much because I still have a meeting after this, but it's Glenfiddich 17 maybe.
I think, a little drink helps everything. I've got to tell you, I'm doing something new that I'm very excited about, and I'm pretty sure that I rock at this recipe, but I don't know if you've all have heard of a michelada.
I've not. No.
Okay, well, it's a very kind of like, it's a Mexican michelada. So Southern, it's being in Texas, I guess it's more popular here, but you guys might gross out a little bit, but it's, it is tomato juice in beer.
That is
interesting.
Wow, that is a little interesting. Yeah.
It is surprisingly good. That's all. If you like Bloody Mary.
Okay.
Yep. So there you have it. So
take your word for it.
With that said, David, you take it away with the first question for Lyell.
Sure. So Lyell, as you know, I've been following your work for a while. You wrote this incredibly important essay for Quillette about the role education schools play in advancing an ideology that we now see at universities, we now see at K-12 education. You wrote a follow-up piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education that built on that previous piece in Quillette. Tell us about, these were very in-depth articles. Tell us a little bit about what your findings were and there.
Well, the Chronicle piece actually, the big one, it came first, and then it was reprinted in Quillette, right? And then I have a couple of other pieces in Quillette, but the Chronicle piece, and I think this is the one you're referring to, is about education schools, and and the title that my editor chose, and I was very happy with it. It's called "How Education Schools Became a Menace," and a menace to higher education. And, this is something that has really flown under the radar for 2 decades. And I didn't even know it was happening myself. And I'm at a college, and it's a small enough college so that not only your fellow faculty members in your department, faculty members across the college, and administrators, right? So the fact that I didn't know it was happening suggests that if you're at a university, the chance of your understanding the ways in which the university is moving are slim to none. So in fact, I was the size of the college was perfect to be able to see this up close. So what I found was, it starts at different places at different times, but around 2010, I just noticed things changed rather dramatically, the way people were talking. And the people that were talking in these strange ways were administrators. And I initially just, sort of brushed it off. I thought, well, we've just made a bad hire or two. And then I kept noticing that no matter how many administrators were replaced, we got the same language. And then I began noticing, these blow-ups around the country. And this is around 2012, 2013, 2014. And then I noticed this language was not just confined to my college in the Pacific Northwest, but it was everywhere. And so I just began sort of tracing. I wanted to find out who these people were. Mm-hmm. And by people, I just mean administrators that work in student-facing positions, not, say, a provost or a vice president or a president, but typically a dean of students or associate dean of students, or later on you get offices in, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or student engagement, or sustainability, this multiplication of offices. And I began noticing that all of those administrators had, almost without exception, one thing in common, and that was a background in education schools. And I knew a little bit about ed schools, and I knew enough to think very poorly of most of them. And so it really began there. And what struck me was, and this is the most remarkable thing of all, that the sort of beacon of American education, the bright spot in the American education landscape, has always been colleges and universities. For all their problems that they had in starting in, well, you go back as far as you want, but even in the early 2000s, for all of their problems, they were still educating students in traditional subjects for the most part, and doing a pretty good job at it. Not as good as they could have done, but they were doing it. The last thing you ever wanted to do was begin mirroring the real blight on the American educational landscape, which is the K through 12 public education system. You just felt that if you got through the K through 12 system and got to college, you were in a different world, because now you were dealing with professors who had studied for a long time in a particular subject, and subject matter was supreme. That was the idea. Whereas that's really not the case in K through 12, with obvious exceptions. There are very good high school teachers. There are very good middle school and elementary teachers out there. But in general, the K through 12 system has been a kind of basket case, and it has been that way for a long time for particular reasons. One of those reasons is the way we train our teachers. And if you begin looking into this, you can go back 100 years and you will find early complaints going back as far as the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and it's unremitting about what student or teacher education schools, how they're failing our teachers and therefore failing our students. The idea that then we would turn to these institutions to fill up administrative ranks in colleges and universities is just unfathomable when you first see it. And of course, if you know anything about those ed schools and their problems, the results that we're seeing now are entirely predictable. So I'll just finish up with a question by saying that one of the ways in which this happened has to do with the fact that there was a kind of professionalization of the administrative side of the universities in the 90s. Back in the 70s, if somebody was going to be a dean of students, typically they'd pull them in from the faculty ranks, right? Kicking and screaming most of the time. They'd do their time for 3 or 4 years, and they'd be put back into the faculty. But these are people who'd had at least a fair amount of experience with, students in classrooms. They knew things were complicated, and they were used to dealing students without an agenda in mind, right? Well, in the 90s, and then from that time forward, higher education began professionalizing those ranks, and faculty were all too willing to let it be professionalized. I use professionalized here with scare quotes, by the way. That is because it just meant that faculty were relieved of burdens they didn't want to shoulder anyway, right? Now, Derek Bach had a warning about this in his 2005 book called Our Underachieving Colleges and Universities. And he said, and he was already noticing it, that when we turned over what he called the extracurriculum, that is, the life in the campus outside the classroom, when we turned that over to the administrative class without faculty oversight, we were looking for trouble. I only read that book in 2013, and I thought I should have paid attention to that. I should have read that book when it came out, because we might have avoided a lot of problems. Of course, everybody would have had to have read it, in order for this to have been sort of challenged at the beginning. Anyway, I don't know if that helps.
Let me go. Yeah, and then, by the way, listening to you makes me want to drink my scotch. But let me go a little deeper. What are the particular ideological manifestations? You said that you started to hear people talk differently. How
Yes.
so? What ideologies were being promoted, and why were they being promoted?
Well, I'll begin with the first time I ever heard someone talk about or say the phrase "is not the intention, it's the impact that counts." Right? And David, I think you began your essay in Quillette with someone saying that, the woman who was apologizing for having not mentioned Islamophobia in her concerns about anti-Semitism, right? And in her apology, she said something like, "I realized that this is the impact, not the intention," and all that.
I wrote an essay on it. Yep.
Yes. Well, that is, there's a source for that. There is a source for that. And the major source for that is the microaggressions essay that people may or may not know about. But it's called Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life by Daryl Wing Su, who's a professor of education at Teachers College. And it was co-authored by 6 other people, also connected with Teachers College in New York. I didn't find that essay until around 2015, when an administrator sent it to me, or sent it to the faculty, not knowing that none of us had read the essay. And then I realized, oh my God, that's the nest where all this stuff came out. So that phrase was uttered by a administrator. And I thought to myself, what in the world are you talking about? Do you know anything about law? Do you know anything about what hate speech is? Or I should say hate crimes? The very idea of a hate crime depends on intention. I couldn't make sense of it. And when I broached the question, there was never any response. That's the other thing. These things seem to be memorized. And if you engage in any kind of intellectual dialogue with these administrators, many of whom, by the way, are nice people, they are well-intentioned, but the idea of engaging in a dialogue that's the least bit contentious about ideas is completely foreign to most of them. So I began hearing that, and before long, it was fairly common to hear it. And it's hard exactly to know what the intention behind that statement is. I'll tell you what the effect is. The effect is to make it possible to suddenly multiply racist incidents by tenfold. Because if it's not the intention, you can say, well, it's the impact. If it's the impact, that impact can be sort of amplified by the administrators themselves. They see something and they say, this is racist, and everybody gets involved and they say how racist it is. And then they say, look at the impact this has had. They create it, and then they point to it as if they found it. And the specific example, which I began the Chronicle piece with, was an anti-racist poster put up by what turned out to be a student of color. We didn't know that at the time, but it was passed around as if this were some racist skinhead. Then it turned out it wasn't that at all, and that's when the administrator said, well, intentions don't matter. And that's when I said, what in the world are you talking about?
Right.
So
I was shocked when I heard that from a school principal at my son's school when my son was in trouble for doing something. It was the first time I had heard that. So not surprisingly, it must have started in an education school.
Yes. Well, and I didn't realize just how quickly it had spread, because if you talk to any high school student or middle school student and you just ask them that, they'll say, yeah, that's as common now as the golden rule used to be. And the golden rule obviously is so much superior because it involves you in the question. It doesn't simply say that, the impact on someone else. Because basically, if you translate that phrase, you can see its perniciousness. What it's really saying is, it's not the intention, it's the reaction. You see, if you say impact, it makes it sound mechanical and like a law of physics. But it's not. People don't behave like objects unless they're physically struck. Then we can talk about impact. It takes away, and this is, I think, whether you say it's intentional, it's certainly one of the effects. It takes away the will of a human being to react in a particular way. And then you say, well, how can you quarrel with this impact, because you've used the word impact and it sounds like you're quarreling with the fact that a baseball has broken out a window. It turns people into objects, and then their responses become mechanical and predetermined in a way.
Sure. So I'll turn it over to Jenna after this, but I have one more question. Obviously, you're a professor in the system. To what degree have you felt any backlash to your writings on the subject?
Not much to my writings. I haven't. I mean, I did have a visit from, a perfectly fine person. I can't remember what her position was at the time. It might have been equity and inclusion. She was a professor at the law school, and she was brought into this. But I had conversations with her before, and she came to my office after I published the essay in the Chronicle about ed schools, and I didn't quite know what the conversation was about, and it was perfectly fine. I didn't mind it, but it was clear that I think she was sort of speaking for a number of people on campus, mostly on the administrative side, who didn't much appreciate it. And I just said, that's part of life. I'm sure that when people talk about, pro-choice, there are probably a lot of people who are religious who are unhappy. So this is what a college is. Lots of people being made unhappy by ideas they don't like. But if you want to stay in a college, and if you're going to have an actual college, obviously that's part of the game.
But you don't feel like you were ever in danger, your job was ever in danger? Well, you're a tenured professor, correct me if I'm wrong, so it would be very hard to fire you, but you didn't feel like you were ever bullied by other faculty members or suffered any real consequences for it?
No, there were, since I mentioned this in another Quillette article, I'm not speaking out of school here. There are plenty of indications that, my, not only what I wrote, but my questioning particular actions on the part of administrators have not done wonders for performance reviews. They've been fairly blatant and obvious, right? So much so that, student comments were actually fabricated. I don't mean somebody filled out the forms, but I had a dean who's no longer with us, no longer at the school, say things about a set of teaching evaluations that no one could find, including my incoming chair and outgoing chair. And the trouble is, when you're in a closed system like this, there's no recourse. You can complain and complain and complain. If I was at a state university, it would probably be different. You could probably get a lawyer and just file some kind of suit, but it's slightly different in a private school. But, the truth is, it's always there. Even people can get fired. And it's become easier and easier because I think colleges and universities feel emboldened. But, I don't intend to stop talking about this. So.
I'm glad.
So one of these things I don't think people fully understand, and I don't know that I do. So I'm going to lay out my understanding of your points here.
Yeah.
I think that at least in Texas, I know where I am right now. I mean, all K through 12 schools, the teacher must have some sort of a certificate or a degree in education.
Yes.
And what you're saying is these schools that are giving out these degrees in education
Yes.
are ideologically motivated.
Very much so. More so than colleges and universities even.
Okay. And that's really interesting. I mean, being in academia myself, just recently, there's been a couple places where I've looked at the applications, both at the university level and the K through 12 level, and you have to sign, and they use the word equity.
Yeah.
It's not equality. And it kind of took me, just the other day, I saw something for a K through 12 position, and you had to agree to this equity. And so I think what people don't know, or at least what I'm just starting to learn myself, is that this is baked in. And I think Greg Lukianoff said this as well to us a couple weeks ago. This is baked into the system.
Yes.
I mean, are there any, could you get a degree in education to be able to be a teacher anywhere where this is not part of the system that you know of?
Well, there are, and maybe for your listeners, this is probably a little helpful. When we talk about ed schools, we're talking about basically three different kinds of institutions. There are there are colleges and universities that have education as a major, right? They might also have a graduate department, in the way that a university will have a biology undergraduate program and then a place where you can get a PhD, right? So there are some places that just have education as a major and they don't have a graduate school. There are other places, Lewis and Clark, for example, is one where you don't have an education major, but you have a graduate school. So you would major in a subject, right, and an academic subject, and then you would go to an ed school to get your master's, right? So there are around 1,500 ed schools. Now there's a third category of freestanding education schools that are really not connected with another university or college. And one of them is the most prominent one is Teachers College, which used to be connected explicitly to Columbia, but now it's only kind of in name only. So that's what we mean by ed schools. There are about 1,500 of them around the nation, which is way, way too many, by the way. Canada is obviously smaller than we are, but if we had the same proportion of ed schools that Canada has to its population, we would have 500, not 1,500. So we could lop off 2/3. And the difference that makes, by the way, is that then they become competitive. And they have to, and you'd also have to control the quality of them. Now we don't have any controls over the quality of education schools. So, but to answer your question, Jennifer, so much depends on the state. There are probably ed schools out there where this isn't a feature. I'm just not well enough versed on all of the ed schools around the country to know where one might point you. However, one place that's very good to look is a website and an organization called the National Council on Teacher Quality, run by Kate Walsh. And this is something really, a website that every parent and every school board, every concerned teacher should know about, because they go state by state. They're constantly releasing reports that talk about what kind of ed schools are in your state, how they're doing on teaching reading. They have a clear idea of what counts as scientifically based reading instruction and what doesn't. So that's a great place to go to find out where ed schools are doing their jobs. The most prominent ed schools, as the ones that have the biggest names, like Teachers College or Stanford or Michigan, they have what they call what you refer to as whatever the commitment is to social justice or that. They call them dispositions. Greg Lukianoff might have talked about this. Dispositions. And really, it's basically a political litmus test, which they try to disguise with another word. And of course, we can talk about the irony of all this in any way. In any case, the irony of education schools talking about equity or equality is remarkable, because they've been a big driver of inequities.
In what way?
Yeah.
Well, take the example of reading instruction that I just mentioned. For probably 60 years now, we've known there's a big problem with the way students are taught to read. Actually, we've known this since the 50s. Have you guys heard of the book, Why Johnny Can't Read?
Yeah, sure.
Published by a guy named Rudolf Fleisch. Or Flesch, I can't remember. But this was he was taking up this question of why our students are so bad at reading. They shouldn't be, so many of them. And he discovered what most people weren't paying attention to, which was that we were teaching reading students to read, and actually I was sort of taught this way. My teachers did a little bit of both. Did you guys have the Dick and Jane or the Alice and Jerry books? You might be too young to
I
get
had Dick
those.
and Jane. I absolutely had Dick and Jane. Yeah.
Yes, I had Alice and Jerry, but it's the same principle. And if your teacher might have supplemented those books with sort of alphabetic learning. That is, I remember having a banner in the front of the classroom with the cursive big capital A and the small a and all that. Mm-hmm. Well, you're lucky if you had that, because a lot of students didn't, and it's pretty rare to find a classroom that has it even today. So what he discovered was that elementary schools were teaching reading as if you were learning Chinese characters. That is, you learn a word as if you were learning a Chinese character. Now, Chinese characters do actually have parts that are vaguely analogous to alphabets, but it's totally different. Yeah, but so basically what you had was, you think about this, remember when you had Alice and Jerry, you learn in an Alice and Jerry book, you learn about 17 words, and they'd be repeated incessantly. Look, you remember that? And the dog was Spot. And, yeah, and it was just repeated. And so you learned what the words looked like just in the way you would learn what a Chinese character looked like. Now, if you're fortunate enough, and maybe Jennifer and David, both of you were maybe, to have parents who had already taught you the alphabet, right? Then this wasn't a problem for you, because you could actually make sense of the words alphabetically. But there's a whole class of children who don't have parents like that, who didn't have time to teach them their ABCs, or teach them that sometimes a C sounds like an S, right? Or what happens when you have an S and an H, it's a sh sound. So if you don't have parents like that, you are up a creek. And that's what happens, and it's still happening in many schools, most schools across the nation, unfortunately. So the people that are left behind in this are the disadvantaged students and the minority students especially. Right. That's why we have in some districts, one of the reasons why we have in some school districts, 80% of fourth graders not reading at grade level. Right. And there's a socioeconomic component in all this, but it has primarily to do with how much you get at home. And if you don't get it at home, that's going to show up in your fourth grade reading capacity, because the schools aren't teaching reading the way they should.
You know, you just said something, you touched on a sweet spot for me, because I speak Chinese, I learned Chinese. And here's something I've had this kind of theory. It's my own, Jennifer's hypothesis. And I love Chinese. And there is a little bit of the phonetic, but not really,
Yes, yes.
So here's something, though, that I think. I think that where you do see some cultural differences in China, and, I have a huge group of friends who are Chinese, lived in China for a while, is that you have to memorize, right? Yes. So there's not it's not like a learning process. There's learning in memorization, but it's not something organic. It is, you have to memorize. So it's very rote, and rote memory. And yes. I think for that reason, again, this is Jennifer's hypothesis. I think for that reason, a lot of my friends who are native Chinese might not even speak English all that well, but they will score amazingly. They're off the charts on English tests and whatnot. And a lot of that is because of that ability to memorize. And so it's a different skill set. But at the same time, I feel like one of the big differences that I've seen is that's a skill set in and of itself, which is an amazing skill set. But where it's lacking is in creativity, because I feel like in the phonetic way of learning a language, where you have to kind of piece things together and put in your mind and play around with it, offers more of a fluid kind of creative environment to learning than the rote memory. And so that's my Jennifer's hypothesis to language learning and language acquisition between a phonetic language and a language like Chinese.
Yes. Well, one of the problems, I mean, people might ask, well, how in the world did we get to that? Did we stop teaching the people sometimes talk about phonics. I think it makes more sense to talk about the alphabetic way of teaching reading. That is starting with memorizing the letters of the alphabet, and their names, not their sounds right off, but their names, right? So we know what we're talking about. Kids love to do this, by the way. You can make this very fun. So the idea that, the students hate this because it's rote is nonsense. If you have a dull teacher, you can make anything dull. But so this is not really a problem with children. So and there's something wonderfully creative, about the alphabet. I mean, it's such a miraculous invention. You don't even think about it. But in contrast to, for example, the Dick and Jane series, if you're teaching the alphabet first, just think how many words, once you learn this short A and the short T, and then your alphabet, pat, mat, fat, you've got words, you've got 50 words in the time it takes to memorize 7 in the Dick and Jane series. It's crazy that anybody thought there was another way of doing this, but this was the product really of an ideology that really takes place that grows up in the 30s and 40s. There was an economic motive too, because one of the things the Dick and Jane series required was you had to keep getting that series of books because each book built on the previously memorized set of words. You see what I mean? So there's an economic motive to keep this going. Now, there's a great resource I just found on this whole subject. I've been trying to find the best books on this. And the best book I've found, and it was recommended to me by another book, maybe you guys know John Gatto, Gatto. He's kind of a wild man of
education renegade. I think it was a teacher of the year, became an education renegade. Yeah, I follow him. Yeah.
So he's got this big book called The Underground History of American Education. It's fantastic, really good. He's just such a
great
renegade.
writer.
Oh, he really is. Well, the book he recommended in that book about reading was a book called The New Illiterates by Samuel Blumenfeld. Yeah, Samuel Blumenfeld. This came out in the 70s. A mind-blowing book.
Mm-hmm.
Because I couldn't figure out where the whole word business came from. The whole language. There's several varieties of this thing where you put alphabetic learning last in the series of things you do when you teach children to read. This comes actually, and this is crazy, it comes from the 1830s when a guy named Gallaudet, you may recognize that name, was trying to figure out how you taught deaf children to read. And he realized that they don't have any way of making sense of a phoneme, because the phoneme is based on sound, but they're going to need to be able to read letters. How do you do it? And he realized you had to teach them as if you were teaching Chinese characters. That turns out to be a bad way of teaching even deaf children. but it was that primer that Gallaudet produced, and I think it was 1835 or 1840. That thing got taken back up in the 1880s, and it circulated around, and believe it or not, it made its way into the whole word or whole language movement as a way of teaching children to read. The second stage of this, by the way, is 1967 with a guy named Ken Goodman. You ever heard of Kenneth Goodman? Ken Goodman, he just died, and he started what was called the 3 cueing method of teaching reading, MSV for short. And the 3 cueing was you taught children to, again, you didn't talk about the alphabet. You just said MSV. M stands for meaning, S stands for structure, and V stands for visual. So you teach kids sort of to read by just reading a lot aloud to them and hoping they pick it up. And then you would say, you come across a new word and you say, well, what kind of word would you expect to be here? So if you're talking about a boat, you might expect a sail to be there. Of course, that's only if you know about boats and sails, all right? So let's just leave that aside for a moment. And then the S comes, the syntax. What kind of word would you expect to be here, And then the third one was the visual clue, that is the letter. Now, if this sounds insane to you, it is. And this has been going on there's a version of this that's been going on for 30 or 40 years in teacher education programs.
Right. And it's gained a sort of ideological fervor, right? It's become almost like a left-right issue.
Well, that's
sort of the phonics people and the
Yeah.
whole language people. Am I defining it correctly?
And just to jump in, that's exactly because they were going to the exact same place. Like, my question is just like, why? Like, was there something broken, and what were they fixing?
Yeah, well, it's okay. I just found an essay today that again, I'm constantly on the search for somebody who's helping me fill in this crazy story, and it's an essay I found somewhere. It's called "The Leftist Invasion of Reading Instruction," and the guy's name is Patrick Goff, and he's a professor emeritus at San Diego University, and he fills in the story about how this got connected with left-right politics. And I knew a little bit about it, but he really sums it up very nicely. Part of it goes back to something you said, Jennifer, about, this is kind of strange. They worried the sort of people, you can't call them progressives, it doesn't make sense, and I suppose you could call them leftists. They worried that when you transmitted knowledge, you were transmitting power structure, right? Mm-hmm. That was the idea. So traditional knowledge, and you can hear people say this and quote this, traditional knowledge is repressive by its very nature. This is kind of a standard routine among sort of leftist ed school people. And of course, also about people in sociology and some parts of philosophy too. So their solution was to, first of all, get rid of as much traditional knowledge as you possibly could. It's why one of the reasons why ed schools have been so opposed to curriculum and a content-oriented curriculum is precisely because they imagine that if you teach content, the content will bring along with it repression. Well, tell that to Karl Marx, who spent years, day after day after day, in the British Library. Tell that to Foucault. And again, I'm just talking about people on the left here. Tell that to Derrida, who taught, history of philosophy course in Sorbonne for 25 years. None of these things is actually true. The way you liberate people, as we all know, is make sure that they have the tools necessary to think on their own, to think properly and carefully. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that there, and I've seen this in some, I was very interested, and I've written a series of articles on education, and I sort of resonate with John Gatto's school. I think that the educational model is broken, and we need to do more to sort of customize the educational experience to kids. But it seemed to me that one of the issues, the ideological issues that was getting in the way, was this idea that somehow any kind of educational approach that worked for, let's say, middle class, upper middle class kids should also be applied to kids from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and that yes. was a mistake. That's the fallacy there. For example, I'm not a big fan of educational testing, right? Because I worry that you end up teaching kids to the test. So I don't want my kids in a school that puts a premium on testing. However, if I was living in an area with a really dysfunctional school system where I didn't think anything was being done right, maybe testing is the way that you make sure that there's sort of a minimal level of competency in that school system. So I'm trying to fix a different problem. I'm trying to make sure that first there's competence. And in my own school system, I'm not worried so much about competence. I'm worried about excellence, and I'm worried about customization. Yeah. And I think that there's a danger in trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach to fixing systems, and that we're making matters worse for kids in disadvantaged environments by bringing that fallacy to the table. That's sort of a digression a bit. No, that's actually, David, that is a key to everything. I mean, that takes us back to John Dewey at the lab school, the University of Chicago. But Dewey
Absolutely.
had enough sense to know that the lab school would only work because they got those kids from mostly the Chicago professors' kids, right? So
Right.
they had a they had training without even knowing it, just by sitting around the dinner table, libraries in their homes. So John Dewey, takes the lab school, and it's worked very well for kids, not only in that socioeconomic level, but who have this basically, 24-hour a day classes from the time they're, 2 years old to the time they're 7. Well, what do you do about a kid on the south side of Chicago who doesn't have that environment? Well, then you bring him into that world, and you say, "What's wrong with you?" Well, they're so far behind because they haven't had the training. But that's the problem too with Ken Goodman. Ken Goodman said, "Look, I know this 3Qing works because I've seen it work with kids, my friends and family." Yeah, right.
Right. Sure.
Ken, have you tried it on inner city kids or kids in Appalachia? No. And the blindness on that issue is just almost hard to believe. And this is why I said it early on: the irony of the equity coming from ed schools in particular. They have been the primary drivers of inequities in the American education system for 70 years.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's another example, and perhaps a very poignant one, on how ideology corrupts sort of clear thinking and solving problems. And I think, to me, by the way, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm so concerned that these ideologies that are supposedly done to benefit marginalized people are actually hurting them, and that supposedly well-meaning people, and some of them are genuinely well-meaning people, are doing things that because they've bought into this ideology that's actually making things worse. And that's why I think that we were talking before we started on the actual podcast about policing. That's an example of making things worse. When you diagnose a problem wrong because you say it's the result of systemic racism, when it may be a result of some other kind of factor in society, you're making things worse because you're not focused on the root cause of it. And
Yes.
and this is and education systems are making things worse when they're applying a one-size-fits-all approach that might help kids in a certain economic bracket and harm kids in another economic bracket. So we make it harder for us to solve problems. Sorry about my little rant there, but
No, you're exactly right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I want to weigh on for both sides. So I've seen. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Catherine Burblesing. I believe that's her name. She started a school in the UK.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Tiger parents or something like that.
well, I don't know. I don't know if that's what she would call it herself. But she's in a low income area in
Yes.
downtown London, and her big thing is you've got to do the basics. You've got to teach the basics. There's got to be structure.
Yeah.
Then I've got a friend of mine who is a fabulous educator, and he's teaching at a school that it's a private school. He's trying to bring this to everyone, but it's a private school where it's really like without the structure, right? It's more of a what's the name of the school? Well, anyways, it doesn't matter. It's Waldorf was I was going to say.
Oh yeah. Yes.
More of like, the child, like let the child's curiosity reign, let the child kind of free play, that kind of stuff. And so I'm kind of in between because, the free play is something that is good, of course. And like you learn through making mistakes. But at the same time, if that it's funny because that worked really well. My friend who teaches in this school, but it's a private school for all, very wealthy kids who get parents are talking to them more and more. They're giving them more and more resources. You look at Catherine Burblesing's school, and I hope I'm saying her name right. And she's like, no, and it's more low income school where maybe they don't have the same resources. She's like, you have got to teach the basics. And so there's these
exactly the point.
Right. Well, there's these two different mindsets around education. And I'm hearing what you guys were saying, David. I thought your point was really interesting that you can't have a one size fits all. But I mean, would you say though in that okay? I mean, in some way, this is a disparity in and of itself. If you are upper, middle class, upper class, they say more people, two parents in the household, whatever, where you're hearing more words, okay, you get to do the free play. You get to do the creative stuff. If you are lower income, you don't have those same resources, you've got to hit the books this way. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, my daughter went to a Waldorf school starting in the second grade, and she went up through the seventh grade, largely because, I mean, there were lots of things wrong with it. Their language instruction was, non-existent, even though they were supposed to be learning Spanish. But there were enough good things about the school that made it very worthwhile. And what's interesting is there was a lot of content. It wasn't just sort of free play. There was a lot of content. They learned about Greek myths. They learned about the Bible. They learned lots of stuff. So that's on that subject, or on that score, they're very similar. If you look at schools and the school you were talking about, it was Kathleen Burbles. I can't remember her name. It's a difficult name to remember.
Burbelsing, I think.
That's right. Well, I got her book, and I like it very much. But the American analogy, there are two of them. One is obviously Success Academy with Eva Moskowitz up in New York. But there's another one up there that I mentioned in one of my Quillette essays by Jeffrey School that's superintended by Jeffrey Litt. It's the icon schools, the charter schools. Okay, so one of the things that both those schools have in common, they're both dealing with low-income students, and I think the icon schools are all in the South Bronx. And they're very strict about a lot of things. You have to come to school wearing particular kinds of clothing. You can't come to school, with socks missing and all that kind of stuff. The two schools treat disciplinary issues very differently, however, as similar as they are. If you want just sheer success in terms of scores, Success Academy is probably the place to go. But if you want success and a far more kind of, I would say, humane treatment of children, then look at the icon schools. They rarely kick anybody out. There are very few suspensions. And Jeffrey Litt, who's, really American hero, he should be if people need more about it. He said unconditional love. That's the secret. So to go back to your question, I don't see these two as a sort of as being opposed. The truth is, those wealthy kids would do very well at either Success Academy or the icon schools. They would do very well. And they would do very well at the Waldorf school. My sense is they'd probably do very well, even better at the icon schools, truth be told. Because those schools it's not just sort of ramrod content memorization. It's the opposite of that in a way. They emphasize content, but with content comes freedom. You're not going to be a jazz improviser unless you know a hell of a lot about music. So likewise, there's freedom in this kind of constraint. The difference is, though, that while those wealthy kids will do well in either school, I think even better in the more rigid charter schools, the low-income kids will not. They won't, because the kind of structure and discipline that most of those wealthy kids will have, just as a matter of course, right? Sort of resisting impulse. I mean, not that all wealthy kids are like that. On the contrary, many of them are just the opposite. But that kind of thing just comes with the territory of successful two-parent families, right? But if you've got a family, and this cuts across racial lines, where the mom is say a single mom, she's working hard to put food on the table, she's not home. That's a chaotic environment already. Those kids don't have the kind of self-discipline very often. Again, these are huge generalizations that those wealthier kids have already. So the freedom for them in the school is possible in a way that I think for the children who are living in chaotic environments, who come to school hungry, it doesn't work for them as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've got one question before we let you go, though. You were talking about, I'm going back a little bit. but
Yeah.
getting rid of traditional knowledge and that content is oppression, and that's one of the reasons that we've seen these differences in reading and moving from I use the word phonetics, but moving from learning like your alphabet to words having memorizing words.
Yes.
But you said you wrote something, and I'm really interested in this. Do you think that that's why? I mean, you wrote something that I'd never heard before. I didn't know. I mean, we hear defund the police, we hear defund this, defund that. Now, what I learned from you is we're talking about defund STEM.
Yes, that was
Is that like really happening? And is that because of that? Oh well, it's traditional knowledge, so do away with it.
Yeah, there is a ridiculous suggestion that keeps coming back, which is that what they call traditional knowledge. By that, they just mean traditional subject matter. So it can go from the history, the humanities, biology, all of these things. That there's something fundamentally racist about these subject matters. And for evidence of it, they say, well, look at the disparities in performances when we look at, say, math scores among 8th graders or 12th graders. And indeed, if you look at the nation's report card, which you guys may be familiar with, it comes out every 2 years, and it basically tells you where we are. You do see racial differences, but the racial differences are very often just income differences, as much as anything else. But it looks like a racial difference, and to some degree it is, because more kids from minority families, grow up in dysfunctional schools. So instead of saying, why is this happening, they say, oh, there must be something wrong with this subject matter itself. The subject matter must be white supremacist. Well, Success Academy just graduated a class of seniors, all Black and Hispanic, who beat the average of white students from sort of more heavily funded schools by, scores of points. And you don't have to have a charter school to do this. There are public schools that do this. So the danger of this is that you will mask the problem. David was talking about this earlier. The problem is not that there is something racist about STEM. The problem is we have incompetent teachers and education schools. And when you start doing away with these things, when you start doing away, for example, with grading, you are basically hiding the source of the problem. It's like the way we fix, a fever is by breaking the thermometer. That's what they're trying to do.
So the funny thing is, I wouldn't mind it if my kids were not graded. But I think that if you apply that same standard to inner city schools, you're going to, exactly as you said, mask the incompetence of those schools. You're just not going to be able to measure them. Whereas if a teacher allows my kids to go out and, and study whatever they want, I'm okay with it, because I know that they have the basics, and at that point, it's all gravy. They're learning how to think. They're learning how to debate. If they learn more of one subject than the other, that's fine, as long as they're learning. Yet I think that would not work at all for these schools that don't have that minimal level of competence.
Well, there's a great book on the subject, David, called Other People's Children by Lisa Delpit, written and published in 1994. And it's so smart and funny and wise about this very issue. I'll just give you one little anecdote really quickly. She talks about she's herself is African American and a teacher and a really wonderful writer too, by the way. And she said, it's funny because oftentimes when white teachers deal with Black children, they will often say, do you feel like starting your math now? Would you? And they ask these sort of questions, right? Well, this is an example of sort of cultural difference. And of course, it depends on the kind of home the Black kid was raised, and the kind of home the white kid was raised in. Not all white parents say, would you like to, this now? But she said, a lot of white parents, white teachers don't understand when a Black kid hears that, at least inner city Black kids, the kind of kids she teaches, doesn't make any sense to them. They don't know what that means. Right. So when they don't do it and then the teacher gets mad at them, they're totally baffled. Whereas if you have a teacher saying, you need to do your math right now, they've got that. So this is just one example, and I recommend this book highly. It's very such a wonderfully interesting and humane book about cultural differences without being sort of judgmental, which most of those books are, and hers is
Right.
not.
So,
Wait, so I know one thing about that particular issue. I feel like we need to develop a compassionate discourse on cultural differences so we can start talking about culture and why it matters. And I
Yes.
feel like culture, when some of the people who critique culture do it in such a in such a demeaning way that I understand why people are going to try to protect themselves against racism, but
Yes.
it's still highly explanatory. And
Yeah.
if we don't learn how to talk about it in a thoughtful way, then we're not going to actually get at the root of some of the problems that need to be solved.
Yes, that's right.
well, that kind of touches what I was thinking is we talk so much about equality of opportunity and everyone having the same resources, but the same resources doesn't mean that you teach the same. Is what I'm hearing from you guys. That's kind of what I'm taking away from this. In order to get equality of opportunity, we have to treat each situation different based on the and that's and then but see when we hear equality we think equal, so it's like if the wealthier kids are getting this, then the lower income kids need to be getting this too, but it's not that doesn't lead to equality, that leads to more disparity.
Yes. So this is a way in which the equity argument. All these things say there's some grain of truth in them. In other words, if you just say we're going to treat everybody equal, we're going to treat the same class, first graders regardless of income. So I get them on this, but the problem is to repeat myself. The public schools are doing the opposite of that. In other words, you better make sure that those kids who are from disadvantaged homes are getting what David's kids. I mean, just look at the books behind David. That means something. So the kids that don't have access to those books and don't have access to a father like David who can talk and who's talks about ideas at the dinner table and his friends over, and Jennifer, same thing. You could look at that and say we have to make sure that the kids who don't have that get it in the first 3 or 4 or 5 years of their education, so that they have basically gotten an equitable treatment, because we have a lot of ground to make up. And if the schools aren't making up that ground, guess who gets left behind? We know that the performance gap between those two groups will get wider and wider and wider. And very often those young children who start out with a gap will lose even more, will lose ground every year to the kids who come from homes like, David's and yours, Jennifer.
It's fascinating because I'm a big proponent of, kids getting, again, I think I conflated equality with equal resources, because I'm like, all kids need the same resources, and listening to you guys, well, maybe not. Maybe they need different resources in order to create the equality.
Yeah, here's the thing. I think I would put it, see if this makes sense, Jennifer. I do think that every kid you can have, let's imagine just a typical public school class, and let's say that public school room has kids whose parents are both professionals, they're both at home on the one hand, and then on the other hand you have a child who's from a broken home with maybe just one parent, and they're coming to school hungry. So that's, let's just imagine that situation exists. So I don't think it's so much that you have to say, well, we got to teach these two children necessarily differently. It does mean you have to, at some point that's going to have to be the case, because what are you going to do? Are you going to, you've got such wide disparities already by the time first grade starts, that even though they're in the same classroom, the subject matter is just going to be so familiar to one kid and not familiar to the other. So you just have to make absolutely sure, and this really doesn't have to do with resources, it doesn't necessarily have to do with money. You can have as much money as you want, and if you're not teaching those children, for example, to go back to the subject we were talking about, if you're not teaching those kids phonics and you're not teaching them their ABCs, it won't matter. No amount of money is going to fix that. And we know this to be true just on a practical level because, sorry, I keep throwing out books, but the series that's been very helpful to me to see this too is uh, a book called It's Being Done. It's Karen Chenoweth is her name. Karen, Karin, I think is how you spell her name. And the first book came out in 2007. These are schools. She profiles 12 schools that are teaching in low income areas, and yet are succeeding. The test scores show that these kids are doing really well. And so she takes 12 of these schools, and they're all across the country in very different circumstances. Most of them, one of the requirements is they need to be mostly disadvantaged kids and preferably high minority populations. And she says, but how do they work? So what do they all have in common? So in other words, and they don't have to be funded at this huge level. Many of them are struggling with funding. Mm-hmm. Not having money doesn't help, but having money doesn't solve the problem necessarily. Right. And her point is that if you look at what they're doing, and she has a list of things that all these schools have in common. And one of the things is, of course, a laser-like focus, I can almost quote her directly, on curriculum, on what students are taught. And the second thing is how each grade level content builds on the previous one. Now, this seems so obvious. I think most parents have it in the back of their minds that, of course, well, sure, that's what they're doing, right? They're not. The typical state requirements as far as grade levels are so abstract in general, they're kind of meaningless. So as a result, most teachers, when they get into a classroom, go online to find curriculum. Over 90%, this is where, another book, Robert Pandicio's book, I think that's how you pronounce his name, on Success Academy. It's called How Other People Learn. I think that's the book title. And anyway, he's talking about this remarkable fact. I think it was a study, a RAND study that came out. They said, where's teachers getting their curricular ideas from? They go on the web. There's typically no sort of stacked progression of content. So it's really not surprising, again, that the American students are not doing as well as they should.
But you would say, in the way that they learn before, this idea of curriculum and this stacked progression, I mean, I feel like that's how I learned. When did that turn off? When did we, you said about 2 decades ago is when you started noticing it. Was there something about 2 decades?
That was when the ed school people started moving into colleges and universities. They had previously been confined to giving degrees to teachers and K through 12 administrators, you see. So so we kept ed schools kind of under wraps and contained their damage to the K through 12 system, which was bad enough, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But around the 90s is when they began making inroads into colleges and universities, and which is just would have been unimaginable in the 80s. Even the 90s, people didn't realize what was happening, but in the 2000s, all that took off. So, and a really great book on all of this is someone I haven't mentioned yet today, Edie Hirsch, whose book Cultural Literacy back in 1987 sort of was a big time bestseller. But his follow-up book, I think, is even more remarkable, and it's called The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. If you want a history of the failed schooling in the United States and why, that's the book to go to. Okay. And he talks about the anti-curriculum movement in American education schools. Now, if you did get a sort of stacked curriculum in which, say the 8th grade teachers knew what the 7th grade teachers were teaching, or if you went to school in a state where'd you grow up, Jennifer, by the way?
Well, all over with my dad in Air Force, but I'd say K through 3rd grade was in Ohio.
Yeah, I don't know about Ohio, but in Massachusetts, for example, there are some very fine public schools, and 10 years ago, there were even more fine ones because they were following basically Edie Hirsch's idea of a carefully set curriculum that was a graded curriculum, not in the sense of marks on a paper, but building on the previous one. And it's the way you teach anything else. So it's strange to most people that there's no set curriculum and curricular progression in most public schools, but there really isn't.
So would you say then, does this go back to what you were saying earlier, that first of all, once the ed schools really became, more ubiquitous, but that it plays on this idea of traditional knowledge, and to kind of traditional knowledge is power, and so therefore we're going to break down the power system, and therefore we're doing away with curriculum. Is that all related?
It's all of a piece. Now there's a second component in this too, which goes back to what was called progressive education in the early 1900s. And people like John Dewey, I mentioned him earlier. And the so-called progressive education movement focused primarily on the creativity of the child, which is, again, something very valuable. I think we all understand the difference, the way we feel differently when we're pursuing something because we're interested, and when we're just told stuff we're supposed to regurgitate on a test. So, as with many things, there's a grain of truth to this. But the progressive education movement brought along with it an idea that the individual child has already basically its essence and its motor. It has its own curiosity, its own almost natural destiny. So the idea that then you would just, put this one curriculum across a classroom and not try to respond to each individual child was anathema to the progressive educationists. So you see what I mean? That's another stream in this. They said one of the other reasons the curriculum is bad is not just because traditional knowledge is bad, but because the idea that we would be giving all these very different individual students the same kind of knowledge, that's a terrible thing. So it was kind of a double whammy that produced the situation that we're in now, where most public schools really don't have any kind of, when I say stepped curriculum, I mean in terms of content, so that students learn early on, about Egypt, for example, or Africa, know where the continents are, so that the next year you can talk about history. You can talk about colonialism in the sixth grade or the eighth grade, because now when you refer to Africa, people know what you're talking about, right?
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. I feel, reading your stuff, and like Greg Lukianoff just touched on it, but it really, then when I read your stuff, I was like, so it sparked the interest, but I didn't know much about it. And then reading your stuff about how we're educating in the K through 12, I mean, it all kind of makes sense. And it feels like the root of the issue is going and what's the word? Reforming, I guess, the way we're educating educators.
Absolutely, that's where it has to start, and then the teachers' unions too. But because there are a lot of great teachers out there, but they're not given. I mean, I had a student of mine, very very fine student, who graduated 12 years ago, and she went into teaching. She went to an ed school, and she said, "I couldn't believe it. I have all this money that I've spent on tuition. I'm up to my ears in student loans, and I learned nothing." And so I was going to be thrown out into a school system, and I had no idea about the curriculum that I was to teach, because I didn't know what the students came to my class knowing, and nobody else knew either. See, people just don't, that's one of the problems with American society. We got two parents working, everybody's busy as hell. They say, okay, well, I'm going to let you take care of my kids. And they don't know what's happening in schools. They know now a little bit better because of COVID, and they get to see some of the nonsense that's happening. So COVID, in that sense, may have been at least a blessing in terms of education, but we'll have to see.
We might look back at this and think that was one of the best things, devastating, but one of the best things to happen, because it is. That's all the stories that I hear of parents. They're like, I would never have known if I didn't listen in.
And as you said, they're trying to keep it from being known by saying no, it doesn't leave the room and all this nonsense. Well, they're doing this to kids as well. They say, what the phrase they use is another ed school colloquialism. They say, what's said here stays here.
Yeah,
it's nonsense.
That's not knowledge.
No, and you ask them why? Why don't you want it to get out?
Yeah. I mean, knowledge is something that stands up to truth, and if it's truthful, then you shouldn't be afraid, right?
You've just admitted to me that you are propagandizing when you tell me that it has to stay here.
Frightening.
Yeah.
All right, Lyle. Thank you so much.
Okay, Jennifer. Thank you so much, and let's talk again soon. I hope.
I look forward to it.
Okay.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say hold my drink and the conversation gets real.